I don't have a mic, that's okay. No, that's fine. Tim has a lapel mic, so you will just have to put up with an introduction from my very loud voice, which everyone can hear all the time.
What's that?
And Jim, because you are always so helpful, we will put you in charge of handing out the handouts. This is a list of the artworks that you're going to look at today, in case anybody wants it, which you don't really need, but here it is.
I'm going to let an experienced handout.
I think everybody knows that Bob isn't here today, and a lot of us, and why Bob isn't here today, and we're so excited for him. Bob asked Tim to introduce himself, but Tim graciously turned that job over to me. I don't have much to say, except this is Tim Mattimoe, and I think you already know that. He's here to talk about art that he loves, in the hopes that you'll love it too. And he may throw in some history stuff, so that you'll see how art and history work together. Here's Tim to help us look at some beautiful art together. As always, if you have any questions, raise your hand and shout them out, because we always want to take questions as we go along in these lifelong learning.
Yeah, how do you follow an act like that? Okay, good morning. A couple of announcements. The first announcement is, in case you didn't know it, Bob is commissioning his grandson as a naval officer, third generation. Okay. He told Karen a few days ago, he said, that's the best Christmas present I could have got. Yeah. Okay. When we talk about revolutions, I think we fix on things like the American Revolution, obviously, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and many others that aren't quite as well known. But compared to the real revolutions, and there haven't been nearly as many of them, these revolutions were brief, relatively brief, and in most cases they involved a deal of violence, fighting, okay? But the real revolutions are few and far between. Three that come to mind. The agricultural revolution, and that took place several thousand years ago when people switched from hunting and gathering to growing their own crops and living in cities. That's where cities came from. The second revolution was the scientific revolution. That started about the 16th century when people started to figure out that they could understand an awful lot about the world they lived in through experimentation. And the third revolution was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is the most recent. It started in the late 18th century, and it started in Europe. It started in England specifically. And it's still going on. Okay, we live in the Industrial Revolution, the late stage, apparently, of the Industrial Revolution, but it's still going on. So why do I say these are the real revolutions? Well, I've already said, with the Agricultural Revolution, everything changed for everyone. Not immediately, not right away, because agriculture took a long time to spread throughout the world, but it did spread throughout the world. And people started growing their crops and raising the animals that they depended upon instead of going out and hunting them. And as I said, living in towns, villages, and cities, for the most part.
And fighting wars.
Well, they were doing a bit of fighting before that. That is unfortunately one of the characteristics of humankind, I think. The Industrial Revolution started when people figured out new ways of making things. They discovered new sources of power, like burning coal to boil water, to create steam, to drive pistons and gears. And that changed gradually as the revolution progressed in the 19th and into the 20th century to burning gasoline, to burning diesel fuel, to nuclear energy. But it's all part of the same process that began in the late 18th century. And it began in England. Well, why England? Well, a number of reasons. First of all, by the late 18th century and the early 19th century, England had established and was continuing to establish a world empire. They had moved into Asia, and by the 19th century were moving into Africa, into areas of the Americas. And England also had a large population. England was also relatively isolated by water, and it had a relatively small landmass, unlike some other European countries like France. And that put both pressure on England and it gave them opportunity. The empire was the opportunity. Now they could bring in raw materials that were otherwise unavailable to them. England had plenty of coal to run those boilers and those machines. They didn't have much iron ore. And they didn't have much fabric material like cotton. But through their empire, they could start bringing in raw materials, manufacturing them into things like textiles and glass and pottery and iron and eventually steel. And then they could turn around and they could sell those goods throughout the world, not only in England, and there was a very large market for it in England itself, and the stuff is cheaper. All this stuff had been around for a while. You know, the Egyptians were making things out of glass thousands of years ago, but now they could manufacture it and they could turn it out, you know, in unheard of amounts. So England leads the Industrial Revolution, but it didn't take long, of course, for it to spread. And the first place it spreads is across the Channel into Europe. Okay? So we're going to look at art. The heart of what we're going to discuss today is art, and how art was influenced by the Industrial Revolution. How art changed in the 19th century, primarily, through the Industrial Revolution. The first picture you see, now some of you may be saying, oh my God, it's one of those modern things, you know. What does that mean? That's not modern at all. That was painted in 1830 by an English painter, J.M.W. Turner. And it is a picture, the title of the picture is The Thames, above the Waterloo Bridge. Oh yeah, I got a pointer. I got all the goodies. Okay.
It was on. It was up in.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Okay, the Thames above the Waterloo Bridge. Well, where the heck is the Waterloo Bridge? You got to look close. There's the Waterloo Bridge. See the three arches across the river? Okay, let's look at a few other details. These are, well, I can use my finger. These are barges, boats, carrying raw materials and manufactured goods. You can see there are factories in the background with the smokestacks belching smoke out into the sky. Because it's on a river, there's a lot of moisture in the air, obviously. There are more factories over on this side. This particular feature, that's called a shot tower. Anybody know what a shot tower is? Harry.
So you jump hot lead and then shot.
Yeah, yeah. And it took a really tall, in this case,
Harry, not everybody heard you.
it's where you drop molten lead, hot lead, and as it drops down through the extent of the tower, it turns into shot, which you can turn around and make shotgun shells out of. Okay? Anyway, this is an industrial scene. And Turner wasn't trying to be fancy. He wasn't trying to do something that, you know, like when Picasso drew heads with eyes on both sides of the head or something like that. This is what Turner saw. Now, today, we might call that air pollution. When I was a kid, we called it smog. Whatever it is, that's what Turner saw. He saw this heavy, murky, blurry atmosphere. And he must have thought, yeah, I'm going to paint that. I'm going to paint it just the way I see it. Why was it so murky? Because of the industrial activities that were going on, the steamships going up and down the Thames River, the factories behind, okay? So without perhaps knowing it, and Turner really never said what he saw, this was an industrial scene. Turner was British, and a number of painters from, say, like France, like Claude Monet, came over, they met Turner, they looked at his paintings, they talked to him, and they got ideas from him. The next picture is Claude Monet. This is 40 years later. This is 1877. And it's called The Normandy Train Arrives at the Gare Saint-Lazare, which means the Saint-Lazare train station in Paris, 1877. The focus of the picture is, of course, the locomotive. That's the Normandy train. And you can see that it is belching smoke out into the air. That's the smokestack. That's not steam, okay? He's probably exuding steam from lower on the train. That is an industrial painting. And it's I think it's a beautiful painting. Not so much because I like locomotives that much, but because it blends the colors, the blue and the white, and the dark of the locomotive and the crowd which is boarding the train and presumably on the other side perhaps getting off the train. It shows the tenders over on the other side, which are small locomotives carrying cars full of coal to feed the boilers on the Normandy train. This is an industrial scene because the canopy over the train station is made out of iron trusses with glass, manufactured glass. Okay? By this time, they could produce large amounts of glass. One of the details I love about this picture is that tall, slim, elegant lamppost right in the center. And you can see further back there are even more of them. This shows the buildings in the background that are obscured by the steam and the smoke on both sides. As I say, to me, this is a beautiful painting, not necessarily because I love trains, but because of the way the color is used and the composition. Critics didn't like this kind of painting. The critics in France, who were the commentators on what was going on in the art world, said, paintings like this, they're like sketches. You know? Real paintings, you go out and you make a sketch of the thing and you go back to the studio and you very, very carefully try to reproduce what you saw exactly. You blend the colors, okay? You make sure that details like the train's kind of murky in this. The details are clearly shown in the picture. We don't like this kind of thing. What's he think he's doing? Give him some kind of an impression of what he saw? Well, the painters loved that. Impression, huh? Okay, we'll call ourselves the Impressionists. And a whole bunch of people jumped on board not necessarily the train, but they jumped on board the movement. And by the late 19th century, by the 1880s and 1890s, they had pretty much taken over the cutting edge of art that was going on in France. People like Renoir and Sicily and Pissarro and dozens of others, Gauguin. Okay? But this is the kind of thing that was inspired by industrialism. Okay. Now everybody knows who did this, right? Any guesses? Yeah, this is Vincent van Gogh. And this was painted 10 years after Monet did the Normandy train. This is a little town just northwest of Paris called Agnières, and it is called Factories at Agnières. Vincent van Gogh, 1887. This is a fascinating painting. It's also a beautiful painting. But notice that it is really kind of divided in two. Okay? You've got the field, the agricultural field in the front, right in the foreground. Then there is a sharp division by this fence that runs all the way across the painting. And behind the fence is the factory compound. And it isn't just the buildings that we can see clearly in the front. Look how far back the factories go, all the way to the horizon, even though because the air is kind of murky, they're not quite as distinct as they are in the front, but you can see the smokestacks. And you can see the smokestacks belching smoke. And you can see the sky is gray and kind of murky. But to me, it's pretty easy to tell which of these two worlds, this agricultural world that's in the front of the painting and the industrial world that's at the back of the painting, that Van Gogh approved of. Okay? What do you think? Yeah. He was an agricultural kind of guy. That's how he started out his art career in Holland. But notice the way he has painted the field with these broad, single-colored strokes, and yet he's got them all at an angle. Like you can see the wind is blowing the smoke from the smokestacks, but here you can see that it has put some action into the field. Notice that there are no human figures behind the fence. You can't see anything that you would identify as a human being in the factory compound. But there is one in the field, okay? It sort of humanizes the field in addition to making it more colorful and more beautiful and with more activity in it, if it's just the grain blowing in the wind. Any questions about this one? Okay, a photograph. Now, right off the bat, a photograph is industrial because it was a product of the Industrial Revolution, that is photography. Photography was invented in various kind of crude forms in the 18th century. By the middle of the 19th century, in the late 19th century, it had become pretty sophisticated. This is a photograph done by Alfred Stieglitz. And Stieglitz did not consider himself, most photographers considered themselves like a newspaper photographer, someone who is recording what's going on. Like the famous photographs of the Civil War that were done by a number of different photographers. Stieglitz considers himself an artist. And one of the things that is characteristic of this painting is there's a lot of composition in it. He took real care in just exactly the angle that he wanted to get. The title of the photograph is Steerage. What's steerage?
Low.
Pardon?
Lowest.
Lowest. Jim?
It's the place where the passengers pay the least to go on the ship. Usually at the lowest part of the ship, usually either at the bow or the stern, where
Yeah. This happens to be in the bow of the ship. And the actual steerage part is below the gangplank. But people have gathered above the gangplank mostly to look around. Steerage also refers to that's where the machinery of the ship is. That's where the steering mechanism is. It was called steerage in sailing ships as well. It's where the boilers are, if it's a steamship in this case. It's where the baggage is stored. It's where the cargo is stored, if they're bringing in cargo. And evidently, this looks like a steamer. This does not look like a passenger ship. Look at the way they're dressed. There is one person in there who doesn't really fit the general dress code that you see here. Anybody pick him out? Who?
Guy with a boater.
The guy with the boater. Exactly. These immigrants were a new type of immigrant coming into the United States in the late 19th century. Previously, most immigrants came from the British Isles. They came from Germany. Okay, much smaller number came from France. Now they are coming in from Southern Europe, from Italy, from Greece, from the Balkan Peninsula. They are coming in from Russia, and they are mostly coming for economic reasons. These were places, particularly places like Italy and Greece, where agriculture was very, very limited in terms of how many people it could support. So they're getting away from their agricultural background. In the case of Russians, they are coming because of religious persecution. The Tsarist government was going after Jewish people, in spite of the fact that about 100 years before they had invited them to come in. Now they are persecuting them. Look, there's a woman here wearing a prayer shawl. Okay? So there are obviously some Russians. But you can tell by the way they're dressed. One of the reasons that they are up here is, notice there's a gangplank. And presumably the gangplank is the way that they are going to unload the passengers. And as it was pointed out, these were places that were the less desirable places. Steamships usually carried passengers, but they would have first-class passengers, and they're above decks in cabins, and second-class passengers, which were also usually above decks. But these were people who were in absolutely the cheapest way that they could get over here. But they were desperate to come, and millions of them were pouring into the United States. This is presumably, because of who Stieglitz was and where he was located, a ship that's arriving in New York City. Okay? And most of these people are going to end up in Ellis Island, where they are going to be processed to see whether they qualify. And they got processed on two categories. First, health. They didn't want people coming in who obviously had tuberculosis or some other communicable disease. And they also had to have a certain amount of money. So even though these folks are poor, they're not absolutely desolate. Okay? They came for the American dream. And this is the American dream they found. Okay? This is a painting called Cliff Dwellers. And as you can see, there's a lot of people dwelling in these cliffs that are pictured here. It was painted by a painter named George Bellows. And George Bellows belonged to one of the first identified named schools of American art, like the Impressionists were in France. These guys were called, and again, the critics came up with this term. They called and they said, who are these guys? They're painting all these poor people, and they're painting these, kind of dingy surroundings. I mean, this is ashcan stuff. So they called it the Ashcan School. And once again, the artists loved it. They said, okay, they want to call us the Ashcan School, then they can. And we will take that, and we will be proud to be called Ashcan. They were interested. Art, American art up to this time was what you would call, back in the day, genteel. Portraits of wealthy and upper middle class people that were done in a studio and were very polished, or genteel scenes of people lounging in the garden or at the beach, okay? Well, the Ashcan guys weren't interested in that. They were interested in gritty stuff, urban stuff, people at work, or in this case, people who were living as cliff dwellers. But one of the things that's so wonderful about this picture is this is really a joyous scene. Look at the people in the street. Look at the kids having a good time. Or in this case, a little kid being chastised by its mother, maybe not having such a good time. But they're out on the street. People are out on their balconies. Of course, they spent a lot of time when the weather was warm enough on their balconies because the apartments were so small and so crowded and so hot, but they're out on the balconies. And look at the washing with clotheslines strung across the street from one building to another. The two ladies sitting down and observing the scene, and one of them has obviously seen something kind of funny because she looks like she's laughing, at least to me. I mean, yeah, this is a tough place to live. This is the Lower East Side, by the way, of New York City, which is still an area full of, they're called tenements. A worse term that was used sometimes were called slums, okay? But that's what was there. And at this time, by the way, this was a relatively recent neighborhood, so these buildings were new. But look at the industrial features, okay? An electric trolley car in the background, a street vendor. Again, crowds of people. This guy sitting on the rail shouting down to somebody in the street. It was heavily influenced, this style was heavily influenced by the Impressionists. And you can tell by the loose brushwork, okay? This isn't the fine, detailed kind of genteel scene that an acceptable artist might have painted at the time. And the further back you get, by the time you get to those back buildings, they're just sketched in very loosely, okay? Just to get the idea that this is a crowded, densely populated scene. But for me anyway, somehow there's a lot of joy. No, it's not the American dream that perhaps they were promised or were expecting, but they're happy to be here, okay? Most of them, of course, are factory workers. Yeah.
Good transition.
Let's go to the next one. Another photograph, okay? This is a photograph called Miners, and it's by a photographer named Louis Hine. Louis Hine did not think of himself as an artist like Stieglitz did. He thought of himself as someone who was going to show some of the problems that were going on in the rapid industrialization of America at the time. So who are the miners in this picture? Yeah, mine ores, okay? These are kids. Some of them are pretty little. You can tell, I mean, just from their size that they're kids. Some of the people in the background, and especially if they're sitting up on above them, are adults. But most of the kids in the first couple of rows are just that. They're juveniles. Look at the way they're dressed. Now, admittedly, they're working in mines. So, you know, you don't put on your Sunday best to go down into the coal mine. But still, this kid, his pants are in rags. Most of their shoes are really beat up and raggy. Why did they hire kids? What do you think? They could get in small places. And because they could get in small places, they could do really dangerous stuff, like setting charges, which sometimes, even when an adult was setting the charge went off. Why else? Jim?
I was going to say, in a mine, you have to excavate high enough that the workers can get in. Well, if you have short workers, you don't have to cut out as much rock that isn't got coal in it.
I never thought of that. That's good. That's good. The main reason they hired kids, though, is because they were cheap. You could pay a kid a fraction of what you would have to pay an adult. And the use of child labor was unprecedented at this level in America, but we were used to it because by this time America was becoming an industrial society, but we were still mostly an agricultural society. And kids on the farm, I mean, you went to work on the farm as soon as you were old enough to do any of the tasks. So it wasn't a new idea, but I don't think that the parents who sent their kids off realized the conditions that they were under in the textile mills, in the mines. Another danger that these kids faced, as did the adults, is you were breathing coal dust 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. No, they didn't have 5 day a week and 8-hour days back in those days. You worked all week long and you worked for half of the 24 hours. And you developed black lung disease. And a large percentage of people who worked in the mines ended up with black lung disease. So it was a dangerous place to work. This was what Hine was trying to publicize. And they put these pictures in newspapers and in magazines to let people know. And it caused legislation to be passed, limiting the number of children and the age that children could be hired to work. Now, it took until the 1920s and the 1930s for these laws to be passed, but it was largely because of the work of people like Louis Hine. Okay. This is Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence painted this, which is called From Every Southern Town, Migrants Came Forth. To do what? To move north. And it wasn't just black folks like are pictured here, it was a lot of white folks too. I'm not too far, my hometown is not too far from cities like Akron, Ohio. Akron, Ohio is the home of the rubber industry in America. You know, Goodrich and Goodyear and Firestone, they all had their plants initially there.
Why?
And, well,
What drew them there?
because it was on the Great Lakes and transportation was relatively easy, either over the water. By then, the railroad systems in northern Ohio and Pennsylvania and on into Indiana were well developed. So they moved there largely, and it was also close to the automobile industry, which was in Detroit, which was not too far away. But Lawrence himself was the son of people who had moved up to Atlantic City, New Jersey, and he became part of an art movement that was centered in Harlem. It was called the Harlem Renaissance, and it was painters and sculptors and poets and novelists, and it was a very vibrant artistic community. But the style that he uses here, notice that there's no perspective. Everything is flat, okay? He called that dynamic cubism. He liked the style of the Cubists, where everything was, straight lines. In addition, he outlined some of the people's faces because they had, black pictures behind them, and you couldn't distinguish that this was a man here and a woman here and a guy here. But they're also poor. They're carrying sacks. They're carrying boxes. They're not carrying luggage. And they're not riding on trains, though they are heading north, and there were railroads that could have taken them north. But notice, even the birds are flying north. Okay? So why are they going north?
Because it's spring.
Pardon?
It's time to migrate north. It's spring.
Thank you, John. Yeah, they're going up for industrial jobs. By this time, the South was not yet very well industrialized. It was getting there, don't get me wrong, but there were still places like New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and there was another stream. This is the East Coast stream that Lawrence is picturing because that's where he was working. But there were streams, people coming from Texas and Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, who were coming into my hometown, Toledo, Ohio, and Detroit, and Chicago. And it wasn't just black people. There were all kinds of white people who were also coming. Those rubber workers I mentioned, most of them were white people. And they were from places like North Carolina and Virginia and Pennsylvania. By the way, that southwestern corner of Pennsylvania, a native of Pennsylvania was once quoted as saying, it might as well be West Virginia, okay? And they were moving up to take the industrial jobs in places like Detroit and Akron, Youngstown, which was a steel city, Pittsburgh, which was a steel city, Homestead was a steel city, okay? So migration, large-scale migration, millions of people who are leaving Europe to come to the United States, who are leaving the South to take up industrial jobs, is another feature of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah.
That picture was made in 1940.
Good comment. I should have mentioned that. In 1939, 1940, 41, Jacob Lawrence did a whole series of pictures. I think there were like 60 of them in all, called The Great Migration. His parents were part of that Great Migration. He was not. He was an adult by the time that he painted this. But he was painting a scene, he was painting a situation, a movement that was going on in the early part of the 20th century. The Great Migration started in the 1890s and it continued through the 1930s. Jim?
I just wanted to say that one of the reasons I mentioned that is for the people in college, for the people in college that seems ancient. For the people in this room that seems like, well, that was just 4 years before I was born.
1940? It was 1 year before I was born.
So you're an old guy and I'm a youngster.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Let me know how that works in convincing people, Jim. Okay. Where are we going from here? Another ash can painter. This guy, this is John Sloan, okay? And this painting was done in 1928. And it is called the 3rd Street Elevated at, what's the intersection?
Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, 3rd Street Elevated at 5th Avenue. And by the elevated, of course, we are talking about the electric trains above on this very elaborate iron and concrete passageway. This is industrial for a number of reasons. First of all, these are all products of industry, okay? But notice the street lights. They're electric street lights. There's a trolley car, another electric vehicle coming up behind them. There are cars, or at least one that you can see in this picture, with a gasoline engine. And the girls are running away from it, probably in sort of mock, oh, don't run me down, don't run me down. But probably the most important thing in the picture are the young women. Because by this time, 1928, young women in America, particularly in urban centers like New York City, were living in a new world. That is, a world that their mothers and their grandmothers didn't know anything about. They had jobs, good paying jobs. You can tell by the way they're dressed. They're dressed very fashionably. They are dressed in the flapper style, the short skirts, the cloche hats, the short hairdos, and they are well dressed. They're making enough money that they can dress up after work. This is probably set at dusk, wouldn't you say? Karen pointed that out to me, that it isn't really a nighttime scene. At first I said, this is a nighttime scene. She says, no. She said, look at the horizon. It's kind of purplish and bluish. So the lights are just coming on, the street lights are coming on. Notice the lights in the shops along the street. Some of them are still open at night, okay? That wouldn't have happened 30, 40 years before that. So it's a picture about how social change had impacted a very large percentage of the population, the young women.
Looks like a watering hole across the street. Sign, a bar or a tavern.
Yeah, yeah.
Young ladies are out for the night, only the working girls out for the night, but young ladies are out for the night.
Yeah, absolutely. And by this time, by the late 1920s, it was perfectly acceptable to go to, I like that, watering holes. Sounds kind of Western, you know. But it was perfectly acceptable. Young women, I mean, many of them were independent. They were making enough money that they could support themselves, that they didn't have to live at home. And even if they did live at home, it was probably a little cheaper. They had a little more money to spend. Okay? Well,
Question over here.
1928 was during the Depression, not Depression, but during Prohibition.
yeah,
And notice also that all of these women are wearing high heels, and working women back in the 1880s or the 19-teens did not wear high heels. Yes.
Guess what, Jim?
What?
Working women today don't wear high heels either.
No, but, yeah, depending on the kind of work you did. But those women are working women yet, they are wearing high heels.
Well, yeah.
Which means they can afford more than one or two pairs of shoes.
Exactly. And they have changed into their party clothes, into their after-work clothes. Yeah, for women, this is a whole new world. This is what, almost 10 years after the amendment which gave women the right to vote? And that was not just a political thing. It was a mark of how society had changed and how it looked at women and dealt with women and women dealt with it. This was a new world for women, as well as electric trolleys on big iron tracks above the street. Okay. Gee, you're all going to get to lunch on time. Any questions or comments? Nancy?
You mentioned on that last picture, it illustrates such and such. Are you calling it an illustration? And if so, what is the difference between this type of picture and Norman Rockwell?
I would say that Norman Rockwell was more polished and probably, you know, at what he did, he was probably better than John Sloan. John Sloan was not interested in illustration, but yeah, this is an illustration. This is an illustration of what life was like, particularly for young women in this new industrial world. Yeah, and that's another thing, you know, many people have got this idea that modern art is weird. It's like abstract expressionism. It's like, you know, some guy standing in his garage with the canvas on the floor slapping paint. It's not. Modern art is very importantly illustration. And illustration and great painters like Norman Rockwell were illustrators. One of my favorite illustrators was Andrew Wyeth's father, Newell Converse Wyeth. And Wyeth was a great illustrator. He was from that same school that Rockwell and many others, including, as I recall, a close relative of yours.
Why is it today that many painters do not think as highly of the work of illustrators as they do of painters? I mean, I've heard the word illustrators and they kind of put their noses down, you know, which always annoyed me.
Sort of a sneering, yeah.
It was just,
Yeah. Well, I think one of the sad things about modern art is how the market has taken over. People are now measured by how much their paintings get at auction or from the gallery. And one of the things that goes along with that is novelty. It's got to be new. It's got to be different. So you get art. Now I'm going to be expressing my opinion here, but there is a very famous, incredibly wealthy artist named Jeff Koons. Okay? Jeff Koons is a sculptor primarily, and he makes things out of blown glass, like balloon art, you know, dogs or giraffes or something, and he has them blown. He designs them, but he takes them down to a local glass factory, and they blow the various pieces. He's not in the glass studio, you know, with a blowpipe in his mouth, and the stuff sells for millions of dollars. Why is it art? Well, it's different, and that's what people are looking for. And the art market is now pretty much dominated by investors. People who look at something and they say, that's going to be worth a whole lot more 5 years from now or 10 years from now than it is now. I think it's sad, and I'm expressing my opinions, okay? Because there's a lot of modern art that I really like, which was not done because it was going to be worth more in 5 years. But that, unfortunately, is the case now. Dennis?
Yeah, these painters and artists, like Van Gogh and the one we just saw, were they just merely painting what they saw, or were they trying to make any kind of a statement about, the different revolutions?
Okay. There is another revolution that took place that affected the arts perhaps more than anything else in the late 18th. It started in the late 18th, 19th century, called the Romantic Revolution. And one of the things that shaped what the Romantics, you know the Romantics, right? Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats and the great poets of England in the early 19th century. These were Romantics. And one of the things that they loved to write about was nature and the power of nature and the beauty of nature, because they were, in some cases, just overwhelmed at what they saw. Like Turner may have been when he was caught in the smog and they decided to paint the Thames River. Also, photography came along. By the middle of the 19th century, photography was pretty widespread, and painting realistic, trying to get as realistic as you could, like some of those 16th and 17th century Renaissance painters. They may have been painting angels and saints, but they were painting them in the most realistic way they could. And that became refined throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The photography came along, and you could buy a photograph that much more realistically portrayed Notre Dame Cathedral, for example, than any painting was going to do. And so painters had to do other things. They had to come up with ways of being different, but yet being different in a way that was understandable, that was attractive, that was beautiful, like so many of the Monet paintings. Monet did, I think 60 or more paintings of haystacks in the same field, in the same part of France. But what was he doing? He was trying to show how the haystack, this common, ordinary haystack, looked different at different times of day and in different seasons. He was looking at the light, coming off the hay and coming off of the surroundings. It was an attempt to do something that a photographer couldn't do or wouldn't do. So painters were reacting to photography in two ways. They were trying to do things that photographers couldn't do, and they were trying to break away from this, trying to portray something exactly as it seemed. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? Oh, yeah, it's lunchtime. Oh my God. The dining hall has been open for 20 minutes already. So if there are no other questions or no other comments, I hope to see you all next week. And next week, we're going to be looking at art primarily from the 1920s and the 1930s. And we're going to be asking ourselves and the artists questions like, where do you live, where do you live? Do you remember learning new things from the people you loved? Are you sometimes carefree and silly? I mean, the girls in that last painting certainly were. Do you ever feel lonely or scared? Are there times when you face danger? Art can show you all these things, and does show you all these things. And we're going to be looking at some of the greatest artists that America has produced. We're going to be looking at Georgia O'Keeffe, and we're going to be looking at Edward Hopper, and certainly one of my favorites, Thomas Hart Benton, in part because he's from the Midwest. But he was also a great painter. And we will also be looking in the third thing at what happened to art during the Depression, which I'm sure there are at least a couple of people here who remember. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank y'all for coming. See you next week.
See you.